Hi everyone. This semester in English 101, you're going to be writing essays in which you use ideas from readings in your own writing. So I have this short presentation to explain some guidelines for doing this. First of all, why do you use ideas from a reading in your essay? Well, the most important reason is that you're going to use that idea to help prove your point. You're going to use this idea as a support in your essay. Where do ideas from a reading belong? Well, this is sort of a map of a body paragraph. The paragraph begins with a topic sentence that expresses the main point or claim. In other words, what you're going to try to prove in this paragraph. In the middle is the body of the paragraph, the illustration. This is where you're going to include detailed support and evidence. And at the end of the paragraph, you're going to include explanation. In other words, how does this support the overall argument? And in the middle is where your evidence or your ideas from a reading will fit into the paragraph. I want to start by giving you an example of a bad paragraph. Okay, this one is bad because we can call it a hit and run paragraph. It does include an idea from a reading, but it doesn't do an adequate job of sort of giving some background about the reading, fitting it into the argument. In other words, this paragraph does not show how the idea from the reading supports the argument. Okay, so this is an example of an idea from a text that I don't think you have read. It's called "Just Do What the Pilot Tells You" by Theodore Dalrymple. And here's the paragraph. One strength of Dalrymple's argument is his consideration of the natural human response to obedience. Okay, so that's like the topic sentence of this paragraph. Maybe you don't understand this, but I think that's one of the problems with this paragraph. In the middle is the quote, "To oppose authority is always romantic in principle, to uphold it prosaic and cowardly." We see this in our everyday lives and in the example of the woman on the plane. Okay, so you read this paragraph and you have a lot of questions. Maybe you don't understand who the woman on the plane is. You don't understand exactly what the argument is. So let's see how we can improve this. All right, so like I said, here is the main idea, the point you want to prove. You're writing a paper where you talk about a text, a reading, the one by Theodore Dalrymple, and you're saying that it's a good argument for this reason, okay? And you use the quote in the middle, supposedly to help prove your claim. What's missing are these three parts. First, an introductory phrase which includes a citation. Second, the quote itself, or paraphrase. Remember, paraphrase means taking an idea from a reading and putting it into your own words. And then the final part is explanation. Okay, so let's look at each one of these parts. First, the introductory phrase lets the reader know that someone else said the words that are following. Okay? For example, we could use phrases like "according to Dalrymple" or "Dalrymple states," "in the article Dalrymple claims." Okay? Now notice that here I'm just using the word Dalrymple. If this were the first time you were mentioning this source, you would have to say, "According to the article, Just Do What the Pilot Tells You" by Theodore Dalrymple. I would have to include the title and the full name of the writer if it were the first time I was mentioning it. Okay, so again, here's an example of how you could write this introductory phrase. Dalrymple states that, okay? And then you're going to put right after that introductory phrase either the exact wording the quote, with quotation marks at the beginning and end of the quote, or paraphrasing that idea, putting it in your own words, but keeping the original meaning. So here's the introductory phrase plus a quote. Dalrymple states that for most people, to oppose authority is always romantic and principled, to uphold it prosaic and cowardly. And you might think this is a small thing, but notice the punctuation. There's a comma before the exact words from the article, and those exact words have quotation marks at the beginning and the end. All right, so what you need next is the explanation sentence. Explain why this quote is important, or give your interpretation of the quote, and you're going to explain how this quote can help prove your argument. Here's an example of how you might begin that explanation sentence. You could say, in other words, the author means this or this. Or by this, meaning the direct quote, the author means something. Okay? So here's an example of how you could add the introductory phrase and then the quote itself and then the explanation sentence. Dalrymple states that for most people, quote, to oppose authority is always romantic and principled, to uphold it prosaic and cowardly. Then you notice there's 235 in parentheses. When you get to English 102 or other classes where you have to write research papers, your instructors will require you to use a citation format like this. This indicates the page number where this information came from. For our class, you do not need to do this. But you do need the last sentence, the explanation sentence. In other words, what does this quotation mean, or how does it help support my argument? In making this comment, he argues that people are hardwired against authority without recognizing its possible positive impacts. Maybe by now you've figured out a little bit more clearly what this article is about. It's actually an interesting article about authority and how humans naturally don't like authority and they rebel against it. Okay, so here is an improved paragraph from the one we saw earlier, and this uses all three steps. Okay, it starts with the main idea sentence. One strength of the argument is the attention to the natural human response to obedience. Okay? Dalrymple states that for most people, to oppose authority is always romantic and principled, to uphold it prosaic and cowardly. In making this comment, he argues that people are hardwired against authority without recognizing its possible positive impacts. We see this in our everyday lives and in the example of the woman on the plane. By acknowledging our natural human response, Dalrymple creates a firm foundation for his argument. So you can see these steps. First, the first sentence is the main idea sentence, and then it's followed by an introductory phrase. Dalrymple states that. Then the quote itself comes, and then the explanation follows. In making this comment, he argues, etc. So there are really two common ways that people use in writing to insert a quote or paraphrase into an essay. The first would be to use an introductory phrase like the one we just used, Dalrymple states. So at the beginning of the sentence, you're telling people where this idea came from. Another way to do it would be to put the citation at the end. To oppose authority is always romantic and principled, to uphold it prosaic and cowardly, according to Dalrymple. There's the source at the end. Okay, there's one other consideration when you're using quotes or paraphrase in your own essays. And you may need to provide context for that quote or paraphrase. In other words, in this course, one of the first readings you read is called Sister Sister Flowers by Maya Angelou. And if you write an essay about that, using an idea from that story, you cannot assume that the reader of your essay has read Sister Flowers. So therefore, you may need to provide some context or background. Where in the story did this quote or paraphrase appear? Which character said it or thought it, and what's happening in the story at that time? So take a look at this example. In Sister Flowers by Maya Angelou, when Mrs. Flowers invited Marguerite to her home, she gave the young girl confidence. Up until that time, Marguerite had been too shy to speak in class. She didn't feel confident about her own abilities, but Mrs. Flowers taught her to read literature aloud, helping Marguerite to find her own voice. So the parts of this example that are underlined give the reader some context. First, who's Marguerite? Well, you can call her the young girl. And then the rest of the paragraph, up until that time, tells the reader what's happening in the story. Here's another sort of more fleshed out example. So we have the ideas that we saw in the previous slide, but now we have a quotation added. Take a look at this one. In Sister Flowers by Maya Angelou, when Mrs. Flowers invited Marguerite to her home, she gave the young girl confidence. Up until that time, Marguerite had been too shy to speak in class. She didn't feel confident about her own abilities, but Mrs. Flowers taught her to read literature aloud, helping Marguerite to find her own voice. Words mean more than what is set down on paper, Mrs. Flowers told Marguerite. It takes the human voice to infuse them with the shades of deeper meaning. Mrs. Flowers' attention to the young girl gave her the confidence she needed at a critical stage in her life. So a couple of things have been added to the previous paragraph. One is the quotation, words mean more than what is set down on paper, etc. So, you may want to use direct quotations when you feel like the language is so beautiful or so meaningful that you can't as effectively put it in your own words. And then finally, the last sentence, Mrs. Flowers' attention to the young girl gave her the confidence she needed at a critical stage in her life. This is sort of a summary sentence that helps tie up and sort of explain and show the importance of this quotation and what's going on in the story at the time. So, like I said, the part at the end you might call analysis is like an explanation sentence. So, in summary, just to review, just keep in mind that we use ideas from readings to support main points or claims of an argument in an essay. But when you use these ideas, you need to include the three parts: the introductory phrase plus citation, the quote or paraphrase itself, and some kind of explanation, interpretation, analysis at the end. And don't forget that you may need to include context, background information about the quote or the paraphrase, because you cannot assume that the reader has read the reading that you're citing in your essay. So, like I said, we're going to use ideas from readings in all the writing that we do in this class, and if you have questions about how to do this, please feel free to contact me.